Hi, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a field crop entomologist with the University of Illinois, and today I'll be discussing cover crops and insect management. And when we think about cover crops, insect management isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind, at least when we look in most of the scenarios in the Midwestern United States where cover crops are being adopted. Insects aren't really a factor in that decision. These are being adopted for erosion management and especially for nutrient loss reduction, especially as we look in the southern third of the state. In some cases, there's some noted benefits with weed control and with some other factors of production. But we don't really think about insect management when we think about cover crop adoption. That being said, insects are going to respond to cover crops. It stands to reason that having a green cover there in the spring versus having nothing or tilled soil like we see in most of our fields in central Illinois, it stands to reason that insects are going to respond to that. And a wide variety of different insects could respond to that system. Some of those may be pests. Some of those may be beneficial insects. Some of those may just kind of be there. You know, they might not have a real strong relationship with our production system. But ultimately, insects are going to respond to these systems. And there was a study recently in Iowa demonstrating an increased risk of damage to corn following a rye cover. And again, it stands to reason if that happens in Iowa, it's possible that that could happen here in Illinois as well. And this is something we wanted to look at with a series of experiments and a series of field observations. So we set out to do a study. This was funded by the Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council. And the overall objective here was just to assess cover crops and the impact that they have on insect management. And we're looking both at the good and the bad, at the impacts that these systems could have on beneficial insects, as well as the impacts that they may potentially have on pests. And the ultimate goal of this was to develop, well, to see if our best management practices for insect management in a rye cover crop need to take into account an increased risk of certain pest infestations. We're also interested in determining if there is an increased risk of certain infestations, how large is that increase? You know, how much more likely are we to see, for instance, armyworms or black cutworm or other insect pests in these systems because we used a cover crop. And in the case of our study, we're looking at cereal rye specifically. So all of these studies where we're looking at a cover crop, we're looking at cereal rye or another winter grain. And again, the studies that we did included a combination of simply monitoring commercial fields. It included some large plot studies that were already established to look at nutrient management in relation to rye cover crops, as well as one small plot experiment that we initiated at the South Farms here in Champaign. And so just some preliminary results to share with you. We're still processing a lot of this information, and of course it's a 3-year study with one more field to go, one more year to go. So first off, our results in sampling commercial fields. We focused in this case on soybean following cereal rye because that's the system, if you look at cover crop systems in Illinois, that's the system that's being adopted most frequently. And we sampled, over the course of 2 years, 73 different soybean fields around the time of planting. So we were sampling the cover crop before planting, and we were sampling the soybeans after planting. And for every cover crop field that we sampled, we had a nearby field with no cover that we could use in our comparisons. And so far out of those 73 soybean fields, we haven't had one that reached an economic threshold for insects. That's good news, and that's not atypical for soybeans in Illinois. It's somewhat infrequent for us to have economically damaging pest infestations early in the season in soybeans in Illinois. It doesn't happen all that often, fortunately. We did have one cereal rye field that was sprayed, and that was due to high armyworm populations, true armyworm. And I'll get to talking a little bit about the biology and the management of the true armyworm a little later in this presentation, but one thing I do want you to know is that armyworms don't use soybean as a developmental host, and they can feed on that plant. They can damage it fairly heavily, at least it looks bad early in the season. But ultimately, they're not going to do enough feeding to kill that plant. And in general, when we look at insect management early in the season for soybean, if they're not reducing stand, we're unlikely to see much in terms of yield reduction from that feeding, if anything. Typically what we see is nothing. We also had a cereal rye field that was replanted due to a combination of not so great conditions and slug damage. This was in the spring of 2019. I don't know if you remember much about the spring of 2019, but it was pretty wet. It was not a great situation for planting, and this particular replant occurred in early June. We weren't having a very good year for planting soybeans that particular year. We had slugs in that field. We also had slugs in the nearby control field. Now that nearby field did not get replanted, but we had some issues over there as well. So it was not as if it was a situation where we planted a cover crop, we got slugs. That's not really how it works in this case. And again, we'll talk about slugs a little more later in this talk. But the relationship of slugs with a rye cover crop is somewhat mixed. It's not a cut and dry relationship where you plant a cover crop and you're more likely to get slugs. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, in some of the other experiments that we've looked at, we've sampled insects and insect damage in a replicated large plot trial that Lowell Gentry and Dan Schaefer coordinate, looking at cover crops and losses through tile drains, nutrient losses through tile drains. We've been monitoring those fields for insects. Of course, 2 years of monitoring those, and we did soybean only in 2019. We did corn and soybean in 2020, and we haven't seen economic damage yet in either year, in either crop. So in 2019, when we look at those replicated plots, we see some time points where we had higher slug densities in the cover crop. We also saw a little bit lower insect damage at some time points following the cover crop. But again, that was somewhat of a mixed result, and we didn't see economically damaging infestations in 2019. And in 2020, we saw very low insect damage overall. Certainly no differences between having a cover and not having a cover, and nothing that we would get overly concerned with in a production environment in terms of insect damage. We also looked at termination timing, both in soybeans with a small plot trial and in corn with a larger plot trial. Again, this was one of the NREC funded trials that we sort of piggybacked on, that Lowell and Dan were working on. When we look at soybeans, we actually did this as part of a regional study. We had experiments in 6 different states, quite a few site years on this, even after 2 years. We'll do this again in 2021. And to date, not only have we not seen economic damage in our field, Champaign, Illinois, none of the experiments throughout the region have seen a damaging infestation in soybean following rye yet. So hard to tell what the effect of termination timing is when we don't see serious damage in any of the plots, but we are still looking at this and looking at termination timing as one of the management factors in a cover crop that could have an effect on insect management. But so far so good in this particular study. We're also looking at this in corn. Now in this case, so far we've only been able to look at this in Illinois, and in fact in central Illinois. And in 2 years of this study, similar to what we've seen in soybean, we haven't seen economic damage yet, so it's hard to say what the effective termination timing on corn is from our trial when we're not finding damage to begin with. And this is one we're actually going to look at this in quite a large multi-state project beginning this coming spring. We've already planted the cereal rye for this experiment. We're going to look at the effective termination timing of cereal rye ahead of corn on insect management, disease management, and weed management in a multi-location, multi-researcher study. Really kind of excited to see what comes of this over the next 3 years. But of course, you know, these sorts of trials are going to be more effective as a multi-state or multi-location trial. And that's because the probability of having a damaging infestation at any one of these experiments is quite low. And that's one of the things, of course, that we set out to look at the beginning in this study is not just, are there insects that are favored by rye cover crops? We know that there are. But what's the actual frequency of getting a damaging pest infestation from some of those insects? And that, of course, to summarize our results so far on this study, the incidence of economic damage following at least a rye cover crop in Illinois is relatively uncommon. So this isn't a situation where we're putting this rye cover crop out and it's giving us a pest problem. It's not quite like that. When you look at soybean in particular, the additional insect management risks tend to be somewhat minimal. That's not to say there aren't pest problems that can happen. You can get some of that tearing from armyworms like we talked about. Of course, questionable how much, if any, economic damage you're going to see from that, but you are a little more likely to see armyworm damage following a rye cover crop. You do have the potential for some other pests, some mammal pests, such as voles, and in situations where you have vole problems in soybean following a rye cover crop, that can be a fairly challenging situation. We also do have a relationship with slugs, and we'll talk about slugs in a little bit here, but it's not a you do X, you get Y situation. It's not you plant this cover crop, you're going to get slugs. It's a little more complicated than that, and in particular, tillage and soil moisture are really going to be what drives slug populations. But we'll talk more about that in the future. When we look at rye cover crops in particular, the potential for issues is going to be greater in corn because, of course, you have two grasses there. And while we haven't observed that damage yet in our trials, bear in mind that our trials on corn have been somewhat limited so far. We haven't had the opportunity to sample 74 cornfields and counting the way we have with soybeans. So still some data that we would like to collect on that, and corn is where it appears that we're a little more likely to see some damage, especially based on, again, the results that were published out of neighboring Iowa. We're still working through some of the identification of these pests and beneficials to really get an idea of what the community of insects is in rye cover crops, so that we can use that information to help us plan IPM programs going forward. But again, in soybean, the risk is somewhat low. Now, while the risk of early season insect pests in these systems may be somewhat low, we do know that there are certain insects that you're more likely to find in a rye cover crop, and I did want to go through the biology and the management of some of these insect pests. And the first of these, in fact, probably I would argue the most common, if it's not necessarily the most impactful, but the most common insect pest that you're going to find associated with a rye cover crop is going to be the true armyworm. Now this is an insect that migrates in from warmer climates in the south every year in the spring. So this insect is not going to overwinter in Illinois. Those moths are attracted to dense grassy vegetation. And so of course a rye cover crop where you have that dense grass is a fairly attractive egg laying site for these armyworm moths. Now those larvae are going to feed on the foliage. They start out quite small. They'll reach a final length of about 1.5 inches before they ultimately pupate, or up to 2 inches or so. A little bit of variability there. But they're going to feed on grass foliage. Now they feed on a wide variety of different species of grasses fairly effectively. The situation that we run into occasionally is we terminate our cover crop, so we kill that grass that those larvae are feeding on, and then they need to find something else to feed on to complete their development. And so often at termination, if you have armyworms in that field, they're going to move over to the cash crop. And this can be especially problematic if that cash crop is corn. We talked a little bit before again about soybean. They'll feed on soybean, or at least they'll attempt to feed on soybean if the situation is feed on this soybean or starve to death. So they'll attempt to feed on that soybean. They won't actually be able to utilize that nutritionally. And so while you'll cause some damage to the soybean plants, ultimately those armyworm larvae that are feeding on soybean are going to starve to death. And ultimately that feeding, because it's going to be limited in terms of the actual damage that it does to the plant, that feeding is not going to be yield limiting. We haven't seen that feeding be yield limiting to date. Keep in mind, during the vegetative stages, when you're talking about defoliation in soybean, when you're talking about just removal of the leaf tissue, it takes an extreme amount of that to really cause damage. Our economic threshold for defoliation prior to bloom in soybean is 30% defoliation. That's 30% of the leaf tissue eaten away. That's probably a conservative threshold based on the data that we have out there. Soybean can tolerate a lot of simple leaf tissue removal at that stage. Now in corn, it's a little bit different of a story, and the reason for that is in corn, they do feed quite effectively on that leaf tissue, and if they're feeding on corn early enough, that can actually result in stunting or even stand loss. And of course, stand loss in corn is a pretty serious situation in terms of the potential for yield reduction. So in corn, we do recommend a rescue treatment if you have 25% of the plants that are damaged. When we talk about damage, we're talking about some fairly severe damage on there, okay? I'm not talking about just a little bit of chewing here and there that may have been armyworms, may have been something else feeding on that plant, you know. We're talking 25% with some fairly serious damage to those plants, and you're still finding the armyworms out in the field. One thing to keep in mind, armyworms are going to be nocturnal. You're not going to see them out and about during the day, so you will have to dig around a little bit for them, just like you would expect with black cutworm. If you start finding a lot of these pupae, that's good news. That means that those armyworms have cycled through. Just keep in mind, because this is a migratory insect, because those moths continue flying in from the south, you may be seeing some of this, and you may be seeing some larger larvae that are about to cycle out, but if you're still seeing the smaller larvae along with them, you will want to manage those smaller larvae. Another thing to note with armyworms, the neonicotinoid seed treatments are not going to be effective against that insect. Some of the newer seed treatment packages that have chlorantraniliprole, a diamide, will be effective, but most of the corn that we have treated is treated with a neonic that's not going to control true armyworm. The other thing to keep in mind, while several of the BT traits will provide some suppression of this insect, they're not going to give you anything against the larger larvae, and it's the larger larvae that are more likely to be moving into corn. So you can't really count on an above ground Bt trait to provide control for these. The good news is an insecticide for armyworm control will be quite effective in general. Now the other animal that I wanted to discuss is slugs, and slugs can be an issue any place where we have excessive or heavy soil moisture for an extended period of time, and especially in areas where we have a lot of no-till. And of course, when you look geographically in Illinois, where we're seeing a lot of cover crop adoption, these are the same areas where we have a lot of no-till. So bear in mind, the primary driver here is going to be that no-till. It's going to be that high soil moisture. It is not going to be necessarily a cover crop. But we do see slugs in those fields, in those areas, quite a bit more often, especially in a wet year. Now the damage that we're looking for, it's especially problematic in soybean, where they just love to feed on these cotyledons. You'll see this scraping type damage that you see here. You'll see these slime trails occasionally. And that feeding, of course, if you have enough of that, that is going to kill that plant and result in stand reduction. Occasionally you'll get this situation that you see here in both corn and soybean, where that seed slot is open, and that makes just a perfect hiding place for those slugs, and they'll actually walk through that seed slot, that open seed slot, feeding on germinating seeds and ultimately destroying those germinating seeds. So it can be a serious situation in terms of stand reduction. And again, we see more serious damage in soybean. You're looking for these holes in the cotyledon, this kind of scraping damage. It's quite distinctive. It does look quite a bit different from, for instance, armyworm damage or bean leaf beetle damage or the other insects that tend to be feeding on these soybean plants that early in the season. And slugs will feed on corn as well. It tends not to be as severe in corn unless you get a lot of this feeding very early as those plants are coming up and you actually see stand reduction. This tearing of the leaf tissue, this scraping of the leaf tissue you see here, once that plant has enough size on it that the stand is no longer threatened, you're not really going to see much in terms of yield reduction from slugs in corn. So they do tend to be more of a serious situation in soybean. Now one thing to keep in mind here, slugs are, again, they're an animal, they're a mollusk, they're not an insect. And as a result of that, insecticides are not going to be effective for control. Number one, the nervous system of this animal is different. Number two, and more commonly, the issue is slugs have a different sort of cuticle than an insect, and so that material that's designed to penetrate the cuticle of an insect is going to get sloughed off by that slug. They actually produce this mucus, this slime, and they'll actually slime away that material, and it won't reach them and won't provide any control whatsoever. And that's regardless of the method of delivery, whether you have a seed treatment, an in-furrow insecticide, a broadcast insecticide, that's not going to be effective for slug control. You might actually get, if anything, it's going to make the slug problem worse by eliminating natural enemies, but you're not going to get effective control from an insecticide. There are a few slug-specific baits available. Those products are not labeled, at least Deadline, which is the most commonly recommended one, probably the most effective bait that we have available. It's not labeled on soybean in Illinois, so we don't have a good bait option in soybean in Illinois at this point. Maybe down the road we will. I hope down the road we will. But at this point, baits, at least in soybean, are not a good option for slug control. Of course, the best control is to plant into a dry-tilled seed bed. Well, if we could do that every year, we would. Sometimes we get into a situation where that's simply not feasible. But what we're trying to do here when we talk about avoiding having to replant for slugs, we're talking about avoiding some of those planting sins that we're forced to commit in a bad year. We're talking about avoiding open seed furrows. We're talking about avoiding planting into either a wet field or planting right before a large rain, a series of rains that's going to keep that field wet. One thing to keep in mind here, the best environmental conditions for slugs are going to be warm and wet. So that's going to favor those slug populations. The optimal situation for damage is when you have that large slug population and then it cools off and remains wet. So those cooler temperatures slow down the emergence of that crop and just give those slugs more time to tee off on those plants. So it makes the damage more significant. And we also talk about residue management. As I mentioned earlier, the relationship between slugs and cover crops is somewhat tricky. And you have a lot of competing observations here. Most of the slug issues that we see, of course, are in no-till country. It tends to be a no-till pest. And of course, that's where most of our cover crop adoption is as well. Have heard observations, reports of where you have a mat of cover crops, lifting that mat up and finding loads and loads of slugs underneath of that mat. You can imagine where having that residue down makes an excellent shelter for them. But it's not a situation where we're planting a rye cover crop and we're seeing slugs automatically from that. And when we look at some of the cultural management options that we have available to us, residue management is probably going to help us more than anything. But anything to get that seed bed dry and warm more quickly is going to help us with slug problems. And especially once we get into a slug problem, if we're in a situation where we're replanting due to slugs, we want to make sure on that replant that we allow that soil to dry out before we do that replant. Now there are some opportunities to see beneficial insects in cover crops, depending on the cover crop that you plant. Of course, if they flower, you're going to provide benefits for pollinators and for some parasitoids. When we talk about cereal rye specifically, the main one that we're seeing is the ground beetle, which is a predatory insect. It also feeds on weed seeds. And there have been several examples in the literature of actually getting some insect management benefits from cover crop systems. And that includes increased predation of western corn rootworm observed in South Dakota and suppression of soybean aphid populations up in Minnesota. So maybe nothing to hang our hats on in terms of, we're not going to recommend a cover crop as an insect management tool, but there are some potential benefits out there to be realized. And especially when we look at this is just another great reason not to put out an insecticide if you don't have to, not to put out an insecticide if you're not at an economic threshold for some particular insect pest. So in the big picture, what I'm going to recommend is you make your cover crop decision based on your needs for soil management, for nutrient loss reduction, for erosion management. That's what you should use to guide your cover crop decisions. There are some insect pests that you might be a little more likely to see in a cover crop. These are issues that we can deal with, and the best way to deal with those is to use an IPM approach to scout for those insects, scout for those pests, and control them on an as-needed basis. And bear in mind, in Illinois, that's going to be relatively uncommon. It's relatively rare to have those economically damaging infestations early in the season. Now, what we've seen is that most of the insect management issues that have occurred in Illinois are not specific to cover crops. However, you do have a chance to elevate the risk of certain pests, and true armyworm is going to be the most common of those, particularly if we're talking about a rye cover crop. One thing to keep in mind here, where you have a cover that's closely related to the cash crop, that's where you're more likely to see some increased risks. And so if you happen to be using a legume cover crop and planting soybean, you will have an elevated risk of insect damage in that system. If you're planting corn following rye, you do have an elevated risk of armyworm damage in particular. These issues are still manageable. Just make sure that you're scouting accordingly. Just make sure that you understand that those particular systems are going to have a little bit of an elevated risk. With that, thank you for your time. Thank you for participating in the crop management conference this year. And please don't hesitate to send me any questions that you have about this or any other insect management topics in field crops in Illinois. Thank you.